Legal Corner of 2011, we ended the year on constitutional law, and for 2012 we begin a brand new series focusing on discrimination and a general overview of employment discrimination. With us now, as always, is attorney and legal correspondent David Lesch.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, David.
Did you have a nice New Year?
Yes, I did.
Okay, well, it's a new year, time for a new legal series. Discrimination is the series that I'm going to be doing for the next couple of months. Now, most of the discrimination that we deal with on a day-to-day basis does occur in our place of employment. So for the first, I think, 3 or 4 segments, we're going to just be dealing with discrimination while at the job site. However, there are other types of discrimination that do not involve the employment, that maybe trying to get into a club, buying a home. These do not necessarily involve employment discrimination. But let's talk about employment discrimination today. Generally, the types of statutes that are going to cover you in terms of employment. And then in the next couple of weeks, we're going to get into specific types of employment discrimination that occur. For instance, if you're pregnant and you're, or you're disabled. Okay, but right now we're going to just do an overview, and the statutes that I'm talking about today, we will hit during the next couple of weeks in each specific types of discrimination. When we're talking about employment discrimination, we're talking about a discrimination based on race, African American, Latino, white, natural origin, what country you're from, gender, male, female. It could be based on your age. It can be based on a disability. All these things occur in the workplace, and generally it can be, when you're hired. Are you getting the same rate of pay as somebody else who has the same job title as you? Your ability to be promoted, your ability to move to another area in the company, your compensation when you finally leave the company or you're fired. All these things are encompassed in discrimination. When in terms of your natural protections, there's always federal protections and state protections. But the first thing we have to look at, start at the very, very beginning, you got to start with the United States Constitution and what your rights are as an employee. The only thing that you have to understand is when you're dealing with constitutional protections, you're dealing with protections usually in the public sector. And that's because the Fifth Amendment, which is very important, the Fifth Amendment states that the government cannot deprive you of life, liberty, or property. And when you're talking about property, you're talking about your ability to earn a living. Okay. So what you're talking about is the federal government's ability to regulate your ability to make a living. And that's if you're working in the public sector. So you go right to the Fifth Amendment if you have a problem and you think if you're working for a government agency, and there's any kind of discrimination. Also, there's an equal protection under the law provision in the Constitution, so that also protects you. And finally, you have the 14th Amendment, which means that the state has to give you the same protection that the U.S. government has to give you with respect to equal protection under the law. Okay. Fine. So now that we have our constitutional protections, we now have to move into the private sector, because most of us do not work in the public sector. We work in the private sector. So what protects us? What laws protect us? Well, the good thing is we have federal statutes for the last 50 years that have been in effect that have been put there to protect all individual employees who are in the private sector. We're going to go through a couple of them now, okay? Okay. Just so you know. All right. First, the first one was in 1963, which was the Equal Pay Act, and that's really basically, is what it says. It's making sure that everybody who has a job is getting the same pay as somebody else who's working in the same position, assuming the same factors, that are there, and they look at, performing under the same similar working conditions. Obviously, everybody should be getting paid the same. Sounds pretty obvious, but back in 1963, it wasn't, and that's why we had the federal government had to enact the Federal Standards Pay Act. Very important.
That has to do with male and female and people working in different states.
Yeah, yes, and same industry, just making sure that if you're working, if somebody has the same job title as you, you're getting the same amount of pay. Okay. And if you're doing the same duties as somebody, you're getting the same amount of pay. Pretty simple stuff, but it's very important. This also prohibits wages based on sex of employees, and also unions. The unions can't mess around and authorize pay for certain people in the union as opposed to other people. So that's covered by that particular act. The second act, the Fair Practices Standard Labors Act, that's Standards Act, applies to employees engaged in some aspect of interstate commerce. That means if you're working for a company that does work over state lines, many do, that's the act you sue under. Okay, so that will give you some means to compensation. So that's a very important act if you're working for a company that's over state lines. Again, all these acts, we're going to be discussing them in the future when it comes to specific types of discrimination, but we're just going through some of the laws now that we're going to be dealing with in the next couple of weeks. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, 1964, very important act. This applies to employers who engage in interstate commerce and they have more than 15 employees. For instance, say Walmart, okay? Big companies, Pizza Hut, those types of things. They're over interstate lines. If you're working for one of these companies and there's discrimination, that's the act you sue under. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Okay, let's keep going. The 19th Century Civil Rights Act, I don't know why it's called the 19th Century Civil Rights Act, but it was amended in 1993, and basically it ensures that all people have equal rights under the law, but the important thing about this act is it outlines your damages. What can you get? How much money can you receive if you've been a victim of employment discrimination? That's the act you go to if you're looking for specific amounts of money. Okay, so that's important. Then the next act, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. Basically, it's what we're talking about, and we're going to talk about age discrimination in a separate segment. But basically, it says that if you're over the age of 40, this is the act you go to if you're being discriminated based on how old you are, and that happens especially in this economy where so many more people are trying to get back to work because they're running out of funds. They've spent all their savings. You go to get a job, they don't hire you, or you get fired, and it's based on your age. Well, that's where you go, the Age Discrimination Act, the ADEA. Okay, the Rehabilitation Act, 1973. We're moving along here at a very brisk pace. Basically, if you get a contract from the federal government and you're working in the private sector, I don't know, BronxNet, anybody, you're getting $2,500 from the federal government, and you're private, then you come under this act. And the federal government has a reach to be able to make sure that you, as an employer, do not discriminate against your employees. So all these different acts are tailor-made for the type of place that you're working if you want to bring an action. And who enforces it? Well, this particular act, the Rehabilitation Act, is by the Department of Labor and the EEOC. They enforce against the federal agencies and employees. So simply, if you're getting $2,500 from a federal agency, that's where you go under this particular act.
That's when you look at jobs, they have equal opportunity employer.
EEOC. We're an EEOC. What does that mean? That means that you got $2,500 from the federal government, so you must comply with that act.
Okay.
How's that? Okay.
Perfect.
The Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, we're going to be talking about disability discrimination in another segment, but this is the act that you're dealing with when you're talking about somebody who's not able to perform their job because of a disability. There's no ramp that lets them get up to their desk. You understand? Or just different ways that your eliminate discrimination against those with handicaps. And it's really also, there's a broader outline in Title VII, which I discussed earlier, but this will cover you if you're disabled. And finally, the Black Lung Act, okay? This prohibits discrimination by mine operators against miners who suffer from black lung. So there are so many different acts that the Congress has enacted to protect you, knowing that the Constitution and the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment really only protect you if you work in the public sector. So we make sure now, as a society, that if you're working in the private sector, you're going to have protections.
And these are all federal statutes?
These are all federal statutes. Now, New York has a statute as well. Okay, but the federal statutes really gives you the strength. Okay, and it's very important that you see these acts. And New York has a New York Executive Law, Section 296. Basically reiterates most of the other statutes that I talked about that give you your protections. New York Executive Law. And that's really it. So during the next, 6 weeks to 8 weeks, we're going to go into each particular area of discrimination. If you're pregnant and you get fired because of that, if you're disabled and you get fired because of that, if you're over a certain age and they fire you because of that, we're not messing around here. We're going to hit each particular topic, and by the time we're done, you're going to make sure you know your law on discrimination.